There is a particular silence that falls over a great hall the moment before a king does something no one can take back. I was standing in the middle of it. The torches had stopped guttering. 200 wolves had stopped breathing. And the blade, Sigrun's brother's blade, drawn in the old challenge form, bright as river ice, was already moving toward the man on the dice, and I understood, in the way you understand falling, that no one else in that room was close enough to reach him. So I did the thing I had spent my whole life learning not to do. I stepped in front of the king of the Iron Territories. I felt the cold edge of the steel stop against the back of my hand, and I heard Soren say my name. Not my rank, not my place. My name, in a voice I had never once heard him use in front of his court. And I thought, with the absurd clarity of someone who is about to bleed, he is not supposed to sound like that. Not for me. It started 3 weeks before any of that, with a veil and a very bad plan. The plan was simple. I would go to the choosing, wearing my grandmother's mourning veil, stand at the back of the line where the light was poorest, and let every unmated daughter in the territory press forward into the king's attention, while I made myself into a shape no one would look at twice. I was 23 years old, a healer's apprentice from the still room under the kitchens, and I had exactly one thing of value, which was the certainty that the most powerful wolf alive would never waste a glance on a woman who had arranged to disappear. You will notice I was very sure of myself. Remember that. It becomes funny later. The choosing was pack law, older than the fortress itself. Every third autumn, when an alpha sat unmated past his prime, the eligible daughters of the territory were presented at court, so his wolf could test the air for a fated bond. I had set out the willow bark and the fever root for 3 of those autumns now, treating the fainters and the criers who could not bear the waiting. I had never once imagined I would stand in the line myself. I would not have been standing in it now if the law had not changed to drag every unmated woman of age into the hall, ready or not, the lowest stillroom girl beside the highest noble daughter, all of us inventory for a king to walk past. So, the veil. I came up the servants' stair into the great hall and took my place at the back, behind the perfumed wall of noble daughters in their festival silks, and I breathed in smoke and pine and crushed lavender and the particular iron smell of the wolf throne, and I waited to be overlooked. The king came in without ceremony. That was the first thing I noticed. Because I noticed things, it is the only talent I have ever been able to count on. He did not let them announce him. He simply walked the length of his own hall as though he had somewhere better to be, and the room bent toward him the way grass bends before weather. Soren of the Iron Territories. They said he had killed 3 alphas to hold this ground. They said his wolf had never bowed to anything living. He had a scar that ran from his jaw into his collar, and a way of looking at a room as though he were already tired of it, and he was the most contained man I had ever seen. He started down the line, a pause at each woman, a breath, a small, courteous nothing, and then the next. I watched him do it 40 times. I watched hope rise and break on 40 faces. And the whole time, I was thinking the dry thought I would never say aloud, which was that he looked less like a king choosing a bride, and more like a man being made to taste 40 cups of the same wine and pretend each was a surprise. Then a wolf came into the hall. Not a shifted man. A wolf, enormous, grey going to silver at the ruff, with the king's same winter-pale eyes, padding through the great doors as though it owned them, which I suppose it did. A ripple went through the nobles. An alpha's wolf did not simply wander into a formal choosing. It was, I would learn, deeply improper. The king's jaw tightened a fraction, which I also noticed. The wolf walked the line too. But it did not pause politely. It came down the row of silks, with its nose working and its ears forward, ignoring the daughters who reached for it, ignoring the gasps, and it came to the back of the hall, to the poorest light, to the shape that had arranged itself to be no shape at all. And it sat down in front of me. And it looked up, and it made a low, pleased sound, like a door settling into a frame it had been built for. "Oh no," I said, very quietly to the wolf. "You have made a mistake." The wolf did not think so. The wolf reached up with its great grey head and took the hem of my grandmother's veil delicately between its teeth, and before I could close my hand on the cloth, it pulled the whole thing back off my face, in one slow, deliberate motion, like a man uncovering something he had paid a great deal to see. The hall went silent. I was looking at the wolf, so I did not see the king cross the room. I only knew he had crossed it, because the light changed, and the cold from the high windows was replaced by the warmth of someone standing too close, and when I looked up he was already there, 3 paces become none, looking at my bare face with an expression I could not read, and did not, then, have the means to fear. He looked at me for what felt like a year. The wolf leaned its weight against my legs, smug as a cat. "Take your beast," I told him, because someone had to say something and no one else seemed able, before it embarrasses you further. A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of the place a smile would go. "He is not embarrassing me," the king said. "He is the only honest one of us." And then he turned and walked back to his dais and left me standing there with my veil in a wolf's mouth and 200 wolves staring, and I understood that whatever I had planned, it was over now, and something I had not planned had begun. If you have ever wanted to vanish and been seen instead, truly seen, in the one moment you were sure you had made yourself invisible, then you already know the particular terror of that hall. Stay with me, because what the king did next was worse, and what his wolf did after that was worse still, and I have not yet told you the thing he was hiding, which is the only part of this story that actually matters. Follow along, so you do not lose the thread of it. I promise you it goes somewhere you will not see coming. They moved me out of the still room that night. I did not ask to be moved. A steward named Gunnar, the king's second, a broad, quiet man with a soldier's economy and kind eyes he tried to hide, came down the kitchen stair and told me the king had ordered a room made up for me in the upper keep, near the library, and that I was to continue my healer's work but lodge above now, not below. "On what grounds?" I said. Gunnar looked at me with something that was almost sympathy. "On the grounds that his wolf will not settle, my lady, and has spent the last hour lying across the door of an empty room, demanding to know where you have gone." He paused. He is not in the habit of explaining himself. I would not waste breath asking him to start. So I went up. And that was the beginning of the campaign, though I did not yet know to call it that, of one alpha king losing a sustained and dignified war against his own wolf, in full view of his court, over me. It went like this. The king did not court me. I want to be clear about that, because it is the heart of what made those weeks unbearable, and, eventually, unbearable in the other direction. Soren himself was courteous, distant, correct. He inclined his head when we passed in the corridor. He did not seek me out. He behaved, in every visible way, like a man who had decided the entire matter at the choosing was a misfire of instinct best handled by pretending it had not occurred. His wolf did not get the message. The wolf brought me things. On the second day it was a heron's feather, laid across the threshold of my new room with great care. On the fourth day it was a book from the king's own library, carried in its mouth from 2 floors down and deposited at my feet in the corridor, while a delegation from a rival pack watched, slack-jawed, and the king pretended with magnificent commitment to be discussing grain levies. On the 6th day, at a formal supper where I had been seated, pointedly, by someone who wished me ill. At the very foot of the table among the unranked, the wolf walked the length of the great hall, stepped over 2 visiting lords, and lay down across my feet under the table, where it stayed for the entire meal, occasionally thumping its tail against the flagstones in a way that carried. I watched the king not look at me down 40 feet of table. I watched him address his wine, his second, the carving of a roast, the architecture of the ceiling. I watched a man drowning very slowly in a flood of his own making and refusing, on principle, to admit the water was rising. It was the funniest thing I had ever seen. I did not laugh. I am telling you it cost me everything I had not to. "Your wolf," I said to him once. The only time those first 2 weeks he stopped in the corridor longer than courtesy required, appears to have opinions you do not share. "My wolf," Soren said, looking at a point slightly to the left of my face, "is a fool. He found me at the back of a dark hall under a veil in one breath. Whatever else he is not a fool." That landed. I saw it land. For one moment his eyes came all the way to mine and stayed, and there was something underneath the winter of them that I did not have a name for. Something that looked almost like grief and almost like hope, and was, I would learn, both. "No," he said finally. "He is not." And he went, faster than the conversation warranted, like a man stepping back from an edge. Not everyone found the wolf charming. Lady Sigrun found it intolerable. She was the eldest daughter of the territory's most powerful noble house, and she had come to the choosing certain of the outcome. Because everyone had been certain of the outcome, the king would do the politic thing and bind his line to the strongest house, and that house was hers. She had stood near the front of the line in silver and waited to be chosen. She had watched a wolf walk past her to a kitchen girl in a dead woman's veil, and she had not stopped smiling once, which is how I knew to be afraid. She acted twice. I will tell you both, because the second nearly worked. The first was at a court audience, in front of the assembled hall. She rose, and in a voice pitched to carry, she begged the king's leave to raise a matter of pack welfare. Was it not dangerous, she asked, for the line of the Iron Territories to be guided by the whim of a beast, rather than the wisdom of an alpha? Was the king's wolf to set policy now? Was a stillroom girl, with no blood and no rank, to be elevated over the daughters of houses that had bled for this ground for 10 generations, on no evidence but the appetite of an animal? It was well done. It put every fear in the room into words and laid them at my feet, and it made my presence not a romance but a crisis of governance, and I felt the hall turn cold around me. I was not invited to answer. I answered anyway. "My lady is right that a wolf chose me," I said, into the silence, before anyone could stop the unranked girl from speaking. "She is wrong that it proves nothing. An alpha's wolf cannot lie, my lady. It is the one part of him that cannot. That is why we fear it. That is why your father's wolf bowed to this king's on the field, and your father followed. The beast knew the truth before the man did. It usually does. I let that sit. If you have a quarrel, it is not with me. It is with the oldest law you have. Take it up with the moon." I should not have been able to silence that room. I was no one. But I had spent 3 autumns watching this court, and I knew the one thing it could not argue with was its own scripture, and I had just quoted it back at the most powerful woman in the hall. Sigrun sat down. She was still smiling. I had made an enemy who did not lose gracefully, and I knew it even as the warmth of having won curled in my chest. What I did not know, what I could not have known, standing there, feeling clever, was that the king had gone very still on his throne, and was looking at me as though I had reached into his chest and named something he had carried alone for a year. I found out why 3 nights later. I could not sleep. The wolf was at my door again, it had taken to sleeping across my threshold, and the king had stopped pretending to send it away, and I stepped over it and went down to the library. Because the library was the one room in that fortress where the warmth felt older than the politics, and I had not yet been told I could not. He was there. Of course he was there. He was sitting in the dark with a single candle and a wooden box open in front of him. And he did not hear me at first, and so for a moment I saw him as no one was meant to see him. Not the king, not the legend, just a man with his head bowed over something small, his great scarred hands very careful with it. The box was full of letters, dozens of them, folded, sealed, never sent. He looked up. He did not hide them. That was the thing that undid me later, that when caught in the softest, most secret act of his life, he did not lie, and he did not sweep the evidence away. He just watched me see it. "I owe you a debt," Soren said. "I have owed it for 14 months. I have been trying to find the right way to pay it, and there is none. So I have written you a great many letters I could not send, because I did not know your name." "You know my name," I said. "You said it in the hall. I learnt it the night my wolf found you. I have known your face far longer." He turned the candle so I could see the topmost letter, and the first line of it, in a hard soldier's hand, to the woman in the eastern woods, who did not know what she was saving. The room went very quiet. Somewhere below, the fortress breathed. 14 months ago, he said, a wolf was caught in a hunter's iron on the eastern border. The trap was old magic, the kind that holds a shifter in his fur and bleeds the change out of him until there is nothing left to shift back to. He would have died in it by morning. A woman came through the woods at dawn with a basket of still-room things. She did not know him. She could not have. He was only a dying animal in a trap. She knelt in the snow, and she worked the iron open with her bare hands until they bled, and she packed the wound with what she carried, and she sat with him in the cold so he would not be alone when he went. And then he did not go, and when he could stand he ran, before she could see him change, because a king caught dying in a trap is a king about to be challenged for his throne. He stopped. His thumb moved once across the edge of the letter. I never learnt who she was. I looked. For 14 months I looked. And then a veil came off a face at the back of my own hall, and my wolf knew her before I did, because he had never once forgotten the hands that opened the iron. I sat down. I do not remember choosing to. The floor simply seemed wiser than standing. I remembered the wolf in the trap. Of course I remembered. I had told no one, because who would have believed a still-room girl had her hands in a dying wolf's blood at dawn and walked home and said nothing? "You did not choose me," I said slowly, and I heard my own voice come out harder than it had been 3 weeks before, because something in me was changing in that room and would not change back. At the choosing. You did not choose me at all. You recognized me. My wolf chose you in the eastern woods, Soren said. I have spent 14 months catching up to him. I am still behind. I expect to be behind him the rest of my life. He closed the box, gently, the way you close a thing you intend to keep. I did not lift your veil to claim you. I lifted it to be sure. I was already certain. I only wanted to see your face when there was finally enough light. I had come into that fortress to disappear. I had built a whole self out of being unseen, because being unseen was the only safety a girl with no rank had ever been allowed. And this man had been looking for me, by lamplight, in a language he could not send, for over a year, before I had ever arranged a veil to keep him from looking. I should have been afraid. I had told myself for 3 weeks that the safe thing, the clever thing, was to keep my head down and wait for his wolf's whim to pass. I was done being clever. I was done being safe. "Then stop writing letters you will not send," I said, and stood, and met his eyes the way no one in that hall had dared to, and say it to my face, whatever the next one says. Say it now, or do not. But do not make me read it after you are gone. He looked at me for a long moment. The candle guttered between us, and neither of us moved to save it. I am trying, he said, very low, to deserve the time it takes to say it properly. I did not save your life because you deserved it, I told him. I did it because you were cold and alone and dying, and no one else came. You owe me no debt. The wolf already paid it. He sleeps at my door. I picked up the topmost letter and set it back in his hand, closing his fingers over it. Pay me the rest in person. Slowly I will wait for that. I will not wait for a box. Sigrun's second move came at the autumn feast, and it nearly took everything. She had understood, by then, that argument would not unseat me. The court had begun to soften. A kitchen girl who had stitched half their children's fevers, it turned out, had more friends below the salt than a noble daughter who had only ever been served. So Sigrun stopped trying to remove me with words and tried to remove me another way. I want to tell this part plainly, because it is where the story stops being warm. There was a cup at the high feast meant for the king, the first pour of the season's mead, an old ritual, the alpha drinking before his pack to bless the winter. I was in the hall that night because the king had stopped pretending I belonged below the salt and had me seated near him, which I think was the bravest thing he had done yet, and the most dangerous, because it told Sigrun exactly where to aim. She did not poison the king. She was cleverer than that, and crueler. She poisoned the cup and let it be known, quietly, to the right ears, that the still-room girl had been seen near the mead before the feast, so that when the king fell, the kingdom would have its murderess already named, and the inconvenient girl would hang, and the strong house would console the grieving court and supply it a proper Luna after a decent mourning. She did not need him to die, I think. She only needed me to be the reason he might. I knew the smell of monkshood. I had spent my life among the things that heal and the things that do not, and they share a shelf and a great deal of their scent, and the cup the steward carried toward the dyers smelled, under the honey, like the wrong shelf. I did not have time to explain. There is never time. The hall was watching the king lift his hand for the first cup of winter, and a noble girl who hated me was watching my face to see if I understood. And I understood, and I did the only thing there was time to do. I knocked the cup from the steward's tray before it reached him. It shattered on the flagstones. The mead ran black, where it touched the salt line. And the hall surged up around me. The still-room girl had struck the ritual cup from the king's own feast, had spat on the oldest blessing of the pack, and Sigrun was already on her feet, with her face arranged into horror, already saying the words sacrilege, already turning the room. Test it, I said. I did not shout. I had learnt in that court that the quiet voice carries furthest when everyone else is loud. The mead. Test it on something that can die. I will put my hands behind my back and my life on the floor beside the cup, test it, and then ask who poured it, and then ask who told 3 people before the feast that I would be the one to spoil it. That last part was a guess. It was a good guess. I saw it land on Sigrun's face before she could stop it, the single flicker of a person who has heard their own private plan said aloud in a public room. And the whole hall saw it too, because the whole hall had been looking at her to see how horrified to be. They tested the mead. A hound would not touch it. And the steward, when Gunnar's hand closed on his shoulder, did not last 3 questions before he gave up the name of the noble daughter who had paid him. I did not win that room. I want to be honest. The room won itself, once it was shown the truth, but I had bled in the snow for a stranger and stitched their children and quoted their own law back at them, and when the moment came to choose what to believe, they chose me. That is the only kind of winning that lasts. You do not seize a court. You become someone it cannot afford to lose. Sigrun was taken from the hall. But she had a brother, and her brother had a sword, and a house's worth of shame to answer for, and he was not nearly as clever as his sister, and so he did the stupidest possible thing, which was to draw the old challenge blade in the king's hall and go for the king, while the king's attention was on me. And that is where I came in. The top of the story. The blade, and the silence, and my hand. I stepped in front of him, because I was the only one close enough. That is the unromantic truth of it. But I have had a long time to think since, and I know now there was another truth underneath. I stepped in front of him, because I had spent 3 weeks watching a man stand alone in front of everything, refusing to let anyone close enough to stand with him, and I was not going to let the one time it mattered be the time no one did. The blade stopped against the back of my hand. It opened the skin, a bright line, a wash of red, the particular shock of cold steel that I had felt once before, with my hands in a wolf's blood at dawn. But it stopped, because the moment I moved, so did the wolf. And so did the king. And Sigrun's brother found himself with a still-room girl's bleeding hand against his blade, and an alpha's wolf at his throat, and an alpha's hand closed around his wrist like the iron that had once nearly killed them both. It was over in a breath. They always are, the things you spend your whole life dreading. And then Sorin turned to me, with the hall in chaos around us, and my blood on both our hands, and he did the thing he had been failing to do for 3 weeks, the thing the letters could not, in front of the entire court that had dismissed me. He went down on one knee. The king of the Iron Territories knelt to a healer's apprentice in a dead woman's hour, and took my bleeding hand in both of his, and pressed his forehead to it, and said, loud enough for the back of the hall, I have owed this woman my life for 14 months. Tonight she paid for it again. I will not spend another season pretending my wolf is the only one who chose her. He lifted his head. His eyes were not winter at all, up close. I am asking. Not the law, not the choosing, not the beast. Me, stay, and be my Luna, and I will spend the rest of my life catching up to what I should have said in the woods. I looked at this man on his knee in his own hall, with my blood on his mouth, and his whole court watching their king kneel, and I thought of the veil I had worn to keep exactly this from finding me. You lifted my veil, I said, to be sure. Yes, then you already know my answer. You said it yourself. Your wolf is the honest one. I closed my torn hand around his. He has been telling you yes at my door for 3 weeks. You only had to listen. I will not give you the kiss in detail. It was brief, and it was in front of everyone, and it tasted like the end of a year of letters neither of us would ever need to send now. What broke open in me when it landed was not desire. It was the strangest thing. It was relief. The relief of a person who has spent her whole life arranging to be unseen, finally setting the veil down and finding the room warmer for her face in it. The wolf, for the record, was insufferable about the whole thing. It had been right the entire time, and it knew it. 6 months later, the eastern woods were green again. I am writing this from the library, which is mine now too, with a fire I did not have to light myself, and a wolf asleep across the door. Out of habit it refuses to break. Gunnar runs the household with the same quiet competence, and pretends not to be pleased about how things turned out, though he is the one who had my old grandmother's veil cleaned and framed and hung in the upper hall. So the court remembers, he says, what it nearly overlooked. Sigrun was stripped of her house's standing and sent north to a cold and minor holding, which is its own kind of mercy, and her brother with her. The strong house that was so certain it would supply the Luna supplies the territory's grain instead, and is learning humility one harvest at a time. And Soren still writes me letters. He never stopped. The difference is that now he hands them to me across the breakfast table and watches my face while I read them, which I have informed him defeats the entire purpose of a letter, and which he does anyway, because he says he spent 14 months writing into the dark and he has earned the right to watch the words land. A letter came last week from the eastern village where I grew up, from the old healer who taught me, who had heard, the way the whole world eventually hears, that the stillroom girl who used to disappear into the back of every room was Luna of the Iron Territories now. She wanted to know if it was true. She wanted to know how a girl who spent her whole life trying not to be seen had ended up crowned in front of 200 wolves. I have thought about how to answer her for some days. I think I will tell her this. I wore a veil so no one would claim me, and a king lifted it so no one would have to. I spent 23 years certain that the safest thing in the world was to go unnoticed. I was wrong about one thing. He was already watching. He had been watching since the snow. And this is the part I will save for the end of the letter, because she always did love a dry word more than a sweet one. It turns out the only thing harder than being invisible is being seen and staying anyway. I stayed. Reader, I am so glad I stayed. So tell me, when he lifted that veil in the hall, do you think his wolf already knew the whole truth and was only waiting for the man to catch up? Or do you think even the beast was surprised by the face under the cloth? I have my own theory. I lived it, and I still cannot decide. Tell me yours below, and if you want her brother's story, and what waits for Sigrun in the cold north. Comment the wolf, and I will know to tell it. Stay with me, her side of the next story is already being written, and you will not want to read it after everyone else does. Where are you listening from tonight?